Welcome to the Queer Witch Project, your resource for all things queer and witchy. I am Damona Peacock, a fabulous, non-binary, narrow, spicy, ordained queerdo with a fascination for all things symbolism, cycles, and patterns.
And I am Moonkittee, a queer femme poly kitchen witch and a proud geek. Today's topic is Samhain and ancestor veneration. Yay! Happy Samhain, happy Halloween, everyone. This is going to be released a day early, so we can actually make it on Halloween because we wanted to talk about something that sounds like fun. And it ties in to being a queer witch very much. Halloween is our Christmas? I don't know. How do we
No,
decide that? No.
it's the Pagan New Year.
It's a pagan New Year. Thank you.
So often it's seen as moving from one half, the warm light, brighter, harvesty half of the year to the, darker, shadow worky, preparing for winter time of the year. So it's like it's often seen as the Pagan New Year.
Yes, we just like to celebrate and do crazy things during the time of it.
Yes. Howl at the moon.
Absolutely.
So you said Samhain.
I said Samhain. Yes.
Isn't it Sam Haine?
Sam Haine?
No, for reals. I really actually know that it's not, but like
yes, that is one of the biggest things that you will see. And of course, all of you who are listening are pagan you to understand this. But yes, you hear Sam Haine and you cringe internally if you've been a witch any longer than a little bit of a time period. But yes, and that's one of the things that Samhain pronunciations can be so different and difficult because it is Samhain, Samhain, in Celtic, which is Samhain, which makes no sense if you're trying to look at an English translation of it. But again, if you've ever looked at Gaelic, it is a crazy language for what we think of as letters and pronunciations and how it actually is pronounced. So yes, since Samhain is actually a Celtic tradition, we pronounce it that way, even though it looks like Samhain. If you're talking about the whale of the world.
I would say I learned how to pronounce that holiday, Samhain. I mean, I was taught Samhain, but Samhain, Samhain. Anyway, there's a little bit, debate as exactly how it's pronounced. But anyways, I learned it was Samhain before I ever learned how to spell it. So to as an audio learner, to my benefit, I knew how to pronounce it before the spelling could throw me off.
That makes sense.
But if I'm ever spelling it, in my head I say Sam Haine.
That's fair.
Just so I know how to spell it correctly. But yes, and it's also pronounced differently in other like I saw Saven as a pronunciation. I definitely found a cool TikTok about how to pronounce Samhain.
Nice.
That I would definitely share the link to in
Please.
Show notes. Yes.
And I recognize that every pronunciation is also going to have the dialect of the person who is speaking, pronouncing it as well. So we're speaking with an American accent versus a Celtic accent or an Irish or British, any of the other various accents out in the world that may celebrate this kind of day in this special.
So what kind of mythologies do we think of for the Samhain time of year?
So to me, mythologies, with Samhain being the new year, like you said, and with the idea of that transition between summer and winter, that fall, that transition heading into something else. The first thing, of course, if you are familiar with Greek mythology, and again, most of us in the US learned at least a little bit of Greek mythology growing up. So you may not.
One of my favorite topics in
exactly. It's really easy. It's the basic stories, that hero mythos, all of that. So you get familiar with the idea of Persephone. Yes. And Persephone's descent into the underworld, whether she was kidnapped by Hades, whether she went willingly, whole other topic of discussion that could happen in the way that the myth is retold. But essentially, it is her entering the underworld.
And you have to look at who's telling the story.
Yes, exactly. So, and with her entering the underworld, then her mother Demeter is grieving. So she doesn't have, and Demeter being the goddess of spring and goddess of harvest and all that kind of summer energy. Growth, yeah. And letting it come down to the point where she's weeping and she's grieving for her daughter that she's missing.
Yes. And obviously the mythology tied to explaining the weather cycles and the
Hmm.
weather patterns, or cycle of the year for the
Yes.
northern hemisphere. um but yeah, definitely, the pomegranates come out
Hmm.
this time of year, and the mythology is of pomegranates being connected to Persephone having eaten, I don't know, sometimes a different number depending on,
Right.
but six, seven,
I've heard three and
5
one for each month. But it could be,
of
yeah,
winter. Yeah, I always
a
think of it
three,
as
six.
half the year
Hmm.
because she in the fall rules with Hades in the underworld, and in the spring returns to visit mother and be the bringer of spring. One
Hmm.
of the mythologies. I also think of Persephone a lot in the spring, but a lot of in Cora, in her maiden form.
Hmm. That
But
makes
in
sense.
Persephone in Samhain era, it's, I think of like queen of the underworld
Hmm.
returning to her throne.
Right. Into growing it back into her power.
Another mythology that a lot of people like to associate with, symbolically, what we're kind of going through during the fall season would be like, a lot of people talk about the descent of Inanna.
Hmm.
And I don't know that mythology well enough to be able to do it any justice, but I do
Right.
enjoy reading about the different interpretations and the Mesopotamian myths and traditions as much as we can know them these days.
Hmm.
Um,
And there are a lot of other cultures that have other descent stories. Because, like you mentioned, so many of the early religions were assigning gods to natural phenomenon to help them understand and explain. So these are just some of the ones that we know. But again, every culture out there is going to have some sort of story about that trip down, about that trip to descent to the underworld of some sort, because that's the easiest way to say everything around me is dying. And what are we going to do about it? And spring, or the idea of life dying down in the winter, is such a universal theme. And it's also interesting to note that, again, we're talking about Samhain because we are in the northern hemisphere. But if you're in the southern hemisphere, this is what would be akin to Beltane. So it's a completely different kind
it's their
of
spring.
celebration. It's their spring versus our fall. So that's really kind of interesting. But I think one of the things I find really fascinating about the idea of the descent myth is it kind of doesn't matter which religion you're talking about, but one thing they all really truly have in common is the idea of the veil thinning.
Yes,
Whereas you are getting closer to the underworld, that means the dead are coming closer up to the surface, or you have closer access to the surface. That veil is thin, and that's where you get the ideas of behind some of the traditions of the going Halloween, trick or treating, Halloween festivals, venerating your ancestors. All those kinds of things are kind of in that veil thinned area, which goes again across all religions, maybe takes a different form, but there's some sort of concept that happens with each of them, and have celebrations that are centered around ancestors and death as part of those kind of Halloween or Samhain, Sam Haine traditions that come out.
so there's one thing to be said about where these traditions come from, with the observation of the natural cycles,
Hmm.
and during this time of year, uh, we're at the last harvest.
Hmm.
This is we've been through three major harvests, end of summer through the fall, and this is pretty much last harvest season, and this is as we are really preparing for winter, that like that whole as above so below, as
Hmm.
within so without. Summer tends to be, and we talked about this on the summer solstice episode, but it tends to be a coming out and doing
Hmm.
things out in the world kind of vibe. And obviously when people were more dependent on the farming and the land and the cultivation for their survival of adhering, you know, without our modern technology, the preservation of the harvests to
Hmm.
get us through the winter. So, I mean, we really are preparing for the death cycle.
Hmm.
So the the concept that the veil is thin because we've harvested and the plants, after the harvest, they die off, and nut- give nutrients back to the ground. They decay. Um, Death is an integral part of this time of year. And another thing that's a very integral part for this time of year for pagans on that spirit path is shadow work. So I think that while the veil is thin, it's a fantastic time to start looking to using that to your advantage, whether it's through divination, ritual, ancestor veneration, learning from all of these different traditions that have had different ways to celebrate this time of year. And yeah, finding the magic in the shifting of the seasons. The message I keep getting from my guides that I've been getting for months at this point is since all those planets are retrograde, the time of transformation is upon us, and it comes at a peak at this time. It peaks heavily
And
right
here's
now.
something that I love, that idea of transformation, because again, Halloween is idea, you are, if you're celebrating Halloween, you are transforming into something else. But also, to me, if pride, like you said, pride, and from a queer perspective, because we're kind of transitioning and we're talking about the idea of the queerness of it, solstice is coming out, like you said. Samhain is going in, but going in can sometimes mean addressing the things that we want to change about ourselves. So that is its own kind of shadow work, is adjusting and saying, hey, I am going in. And that may be those first baby steps of exploring outside of your gender role. That may be doing things that you have an official excuse to do it, but that may be those first steps that you get as a
Yes.
queer person to explore gender roles, to maybe explore drag as a performance art, but also as a representative art form, or other things else that could be a part of shadow work just as much as coming out relates to the summer solstice.
Yeah, I think dressing up for Halloween, that tradition, back in the day, was in the Celtic tradition, was dressing like that thought that the spirits are visiting, or sometimes malicious spirits or demons or whatever they want to call it would be roaming free on All Hallows Eve. And so we would dress our kids up or dress ourselves up to fool these spirits, and not to make them think we're one of them, instead of so they don't plague us or whatever. But symbolically, maybe the idea of being who you were taught to be in this world, that wearing that mask every day can get broken through on a magical time like Samhain and or Halloween, where you're encouraged to explore parts of yourself that you may not have otherwise explored if you hadn't had an excuse to dress up in a costume, or to change, to explore the freedom and gender expressions. A lot of people's first time playing with makeup of any sort could be happening around Halloween. FX makeup or drag makeup, or having access to that kind of materials.
And you might find overall that you actually would rather be with the spirits or on the side of the others rather than what's happening in mainstream that comes out of it. So there is kind of that joy in being able to express yourself in a different kind of way that allows you to not just be out, but go deeper.
Become a goblin and join the mischievous spirits out there
Exactly.
for the night.
Embrace that mischief, embrace that part of you that, hey, this is a different part. This is a different part of you that wants to come out. Now, if you're the person that wants to come out is a sexy nurse, that's all good too. It could be that maybe something that's a part of you that's been hiding in there that needs to come out, and that kind of exploration. And that is also a different kind of form of shadow work that relates around that time of year, but also being able to acknowledge those hidden parts of ourselves. And I
Yes.
think again, Samhain does that really, really well. And you mentioned All Hallows Eve, and you
Take
mentioned
off one mask
Halloween.
and put on another.
And be who you want to be for a night.
Yeah.
And that's really kind of empowering in a
Yeah,
lot
there's
of ways.
a lot of drag queens, because I do a bit of drag queen connoisseurism. But I've seen a lot of them saying, yeah, my first time in drag, or yeah, my first time in drag or trying women's
Mhm.
clothing was for Halloween or, homecoming week in high school. But yeah, that's another story.
That makes sense.
Which is
And
also around in October, I believe. So
yeah, I'm trying to remember because it's been a long time since high school. But yeah, I want to say ours is like end of September, beginning of October for homecoming week.
yeah.
And it's funny, now this is a complete tangent, but the idea of homecoming, that in itself could
Mm,
totally relate to that idea of coming home, coming back into ourselves, into
yeah.
the darkness within, and buckling down and starting to embrace what's going to happen and change over that next period of time.
Yes, yes. We've spent so much energy growing
Hmm.
from spring through summer. And now it's kind of a time to go inward to assess that growth and prepare for a rest
Hmm.
from that growth in order to be able to start the cycle over when we hit spring
Hmm.
again.
And to buckle
Yeah.
down and learn a
Oh
little bit.
yes. Yeah. Study and go internal.
Hmm.
I could never talk that up enough, whether it's through meditation or guided
Hmm.
meditation or chant work or, whatever floats your boat, physical exercise, but whatever can get your mind to shush up enough for you to really just like deeply connect to your inner wisdom
Hmm.
and your intuition. Like that's so important. And it's, you know, so I feel like there's so much more time to do that when it's cold outside and you can't go out and do all the things.
Exactly. You have less ability to be outside where it's nice and warm. And
Yes.
and again, we are both in California, so
Right.
our winters are not as
As yeah.
miserable as other places in the US, thankfully, um, where we are not so completely housebound as some areas of the world can be and during winter. So, but that idea of still going in and we still want to, I don't know about you, I still want to curl up with a cozy book and learn something by a warm
Yeah.
fire or under a nice warm blanket with a cup of apple
Candlelight.
cider,
Mm-hmm.
something that's just
Yeah.
nice and cozy and warm that kind of helps me think about where I want to go for the next cycle.
The other thing I love about this time of year is sitting around a bonfire.
Hmm.
Like big on the like campfires, bonfire, obviously uh safely done because we
Yes.
are in California and fire season goes really late.
It goes, yeah, that's my things. I love bonfires, but honestly, it's one of those things that unless it's a self-contained fire pit in someone's backyard,
Or in the middle of a desert, I suppose.
yeah, in the middle of a desert also works too. But same thing, it has to be someplace that I found myself much more ego conscious
Mm-hmm.
about that
Yeah.
and not even wanting to burn wood to do that kind of thing, even though it brings me so much joy. It's really hard to want to have bonfires anymore when I see what the destruction does. Like I said again, for those who are listening, we are recording in the middle of, or sorry, end of September right now for the, or end of August for this,
Yeah.
and the wildfires that just devastated Maui
Yeah.
and Lahaina being wiped out and being
Yeah.
parallel to Paradise being wiped out in
Mm-hmm.
California. And so it's that
And so many
completely,
other
yeah,
areas.
just other areas that are just wiped out that I see the power of fire.
Yeah.
And I have a harder time with bonfires now than I used to,
I
unless
have a
it's
hard time with
really, really contained.
smoky skies.
Hmm.
Just
Ugh.
worry.
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 And that's a total tangent that we could absolutely cut
Total
out.
tangent. Yes, yes. So what are some of the different cultural ways in which this time of year is celebrated? What are some of the traditions?
Again, there's a lot of different traditions out there. And this is one of the fun things that I was doing some research for this podcast is talking about other cultures. Again, culturally growing up, I am most familiar with Catholic, Celtic traditions.
Mm,
I grew up Irish Catholic. And then, of course, Catholics make the best pagans as we transition out into something else. But so I'm mostly familiar with the idea of All Hallows Eve, All Saints Day, All Souls Day. all of those kinds of traditions that come around that. I know, again, being in California, there is a heavy Hispanic population, heavy Latino population. So we're also familiar with, though it's definitely not our culture, is the idea of the Dia de los Muertos, where it's a different aspect of ancestor veneration that's very, very common around this area. But I
this time of
also,
year.
yeah, I
I
found some
think it's
other.
usually falls around, I want to say November 1st or 2nd, but
Yes. Yeah, same thing.
yeah,
It kind of coincides with the because again a lot
honoring
of
the ancestors. The
honoring.
ancestors are visiting. They can see through the veil. It's thin. Yes, that whole. I mean, it's not my tradition, but like I love learning about it. I love
Hmm.
witnessing it and like honoring it. It's just beautiful. I won't.
Yeah.
You know, I just think I mean I really am a sucker for
Hmm.
the stories and
Yes.
the traditions that everybody the different approaches that you can see to that
Hmm.
concept of honoring that thinning of the veil
Hmm.
and thinking about death and thinking about those that came before us.
Hmm. And it's really fascinating. And again, I want to put out there for our listeners that we are truly trying to be very culture conscious,
Yes.
of who we are, where we are, and where we're
Yeah.
standing, and what we're and how we present things. So, if at any point in time, if we approach something that you feel was not with respect, please let us know, because we do want to know in the comments, because we truly do not want to be speaking about things that are not ours to speak on.
And if you are of a culture that has traditions that you would love to come teach us about, we love
Please.
having guest speakers on, and we would love to have people who, have come from that background and have those traditions that they can speak on.
Hmm.
Yeah. Speaking of ancestors and, culture conscious, one of the things that I feel we all could do that would be beautiful in a way of honoring this time of year and honoring ancestors is to consider the ancestry of the land
Hmm.
on which you reside. So for Moon and myself, we both live in different parts of Northern California.
Hmm.
But the idea of looking up land acknowledgements and or looking into how to write your own land acknowledgement for, the area in which you live and or work or go to school, and realizing that in at least in the USLA, we are living on colonized land,
Hmm.
and these lands were not seceded, and these tribes still exist.
Hmm.
And um, I think it's important nowadays, well, anytime, but like because of our history and how suppressed this information was to the colonized culture, it's so
Hmm.
important to uncolonize as much as we can and realize the ancestors of the land in which we are living have been stewarded by these beautiful people of this land for a lot longer than our personal bloodline ancestors have been here.
Hmm.
So for like I wanted along that line, I did look up to see what tribes would be stewards of the land in which I live and work and show up for this podcast. And
Hmm.
I learned that this area was a, kind of a gathering place, the Sacramento area, just so for those that don't know, for a multitude of tribes that include the Nisenan people, the Southern Maidu, Valley and Plains Miwok, Patwin Wintun peoples, and the people of the Wilton Rancheria, Sacramento's only federally recognized tribe.
And where I live was originally in the stewardship, in the custody of the Muwekma, Patwin, Miwok, and Karkin tribes. And then for part of my job is here, and then part of my job is in Sacramento. So it's also the same kind of tribes where Damona does as well. So it's kind of that crossover, that kind of central California
So just
from
like when
coast
we,
inward.
yeah, so when we talk about honoring the ancestors, you don't just, I don't think of the ancestors as just my bloodline. I
Mm-mm.
think about my queer ancestry.
Yes.
They didn't necessarily birth me or raise me, but they came before me in my community and paved way. And I also think about the ancestry of the land stewardships, those that have been a part of this land, whose, blood, sweat, and tears and ancestry and bones are in this land and have been for thousands of years, long before my ancestors moved here a
Hmm.
couple of generations ago.
Right.
So the honoring all of these kind of ancestors at this time of year is huge, and not just powerful, but soul
Mhm.
rewarding.
And it's approaching it with respect, because I would never approach that kind of thing with trying to mimic a tradition that's not mine, but I would absolutely kind of honor and respect the cultures that were there by listening, by trying to find modern day descendants,
Yes.
learning about the cultures and the peoples that were there, and just respecting
Supporting
that.
them
Hmm.
in current times, whether it's through their teaching, absorbing their teaching, buying their books, buying their arts and crafts, attending their lectures.
Hmm. And that
Yeah.
goes for all the kinds of ancestors that we have. Like, so you mentioned
Yes.
the ancient ancestors of the lands, but also the ancestors of our cultural traditions that we
Yes.
learned and we grew from, and our queer ancestors as well, all of which who shape us, because we are not we are never a single seed. We are shaped by the ground, we are shaped by the influences around us to become who we are. And all of those things have that
Yeah.
kind of effect on us for
Yeah.
how we grow. So honoring our queer ancestors, I love the way that you said that, because that is something that we again need to acknowledge. They may have no blood relation to us in any way, shape, or form, but they still shaped who we are. And
Yes.
acknowledging that in that kind of spiritual sense, I think is incredibly important. And there's so many different ways to do
Hmm.
all of this, whether it's land ancestors, cultural ancestors, queer ancestors. There's so many different ways that you can honor the different traditions and things that are out there. So,
Can I?
what are some of your favorite ways to honor ancestors?
I was going to ask if I can share with you what I plan to do.
Absolutely, please.
Yeah. Well, I was working on repairing my grandfather's niches, and that got completed in this, I want to say, late spring, early summer.
Hmm.
But it gets hot, and I haven't been back up there. So now that it's cooled off, I want to go back and bring more offerings.
Hmm.
And in that one cemetery, I have two grandfathers and a great grandmother buried there. So I want to bring offerings to my family's ancestry. And I also like to visit the grave of my friend Karen, who uh, passed away a few years after high school,
Hmm.
um, who was probably the first, like, big sister lesbian I ever had, aside
Hmm.
from, well, long story short, she was dating my sister, but my sister
Hmm.
hated me and Karen loved me. So I like to visit her grave because I see her as one of my
Hmm.
queer ancestors, as a sister that saw me for who I was.
Hmm.
And I will take the Raven Moon tarot deck out, and
Hmm.
I will talk to Raven Moon. And I will offer readings to anybody who wants to connect with their ancestor or recently deceased. I will meet
Hmm.
somebody at their, loved one's graveside with the tarot deck if that's what helps, or is
Hmm.
wanted or warranted. Those are all different ways that I personally love to celebrate and make the best of this thinning of the veil
Hmm.
and this time of year.
I love
What
it.
about you? What are your
A couple
traditions?
a couple of things. It's funny you mentioned Raven Moon, because as you know, as you told me, and as I learned, he was a huge burner. And I am, again, we're recording this at the end of August, and I am literally heading out to Burning Man
Yeah.
tomorrow. So there is what's called Temple, which is a huge non-denominational, just pure spiritual energy. And I fully intend to go out there, acknowledge Raven Moon as, again, one of my queer ancestors. And I put out to all of my queer friends and anyone out there as well, if they want something to be said, a poem or something to be read in honor, I'm happy to take all of that energy with me to,
Mm-hmm.
reflect the ancestor veneration when I'm there. Like you, when it comes to visiting graves. I fully admit I'm not the best about going to cemeteries outside of going to a funeral. But
Yeah.
when I am there's one particular cemetery in Sacramento where a good portion of my family is buried, and also friends. So whenever I am in there for anything else, I will always go by my grandparents' graves. And
Yeah.
same thing, like your friend Karen, growing up, I had a childhood friend named Dusty, and he was about a year or two younger than I was, but
Mm.
he lived next door to my grandparents, and I was going over there all the time, and I was really close to his family and his mom. And he was diagnosed with a brain tumor as a
Mm.
child, and he passed away on Christmas Day at about 7 or 8 years old.
Wow.
And I was actually, because I'd gone over for Christmas Eve, I went over and said goodbye. And I was actually one of the
Mm-hmm.
last people outside of this family to say goodbye.
Mm.
So every time at the cemetery, it doesn't matter, I will never forget where he is there. So it's a different kind of ancestor, a friendship ancestor,
Yeah.
but it's
Yeah.
still, I think about that idea of so much that he taught me about grief and about love and about taking and making the most of a moment, even as a child. Um, Seeing all of that. So I will absolutely visit that every single time. And when I am just home, I try to take a moment on Halloween, on Samhain, or in the days in between, and just think about all of the people in my life who have passed and how they have shaped me, and those people who have meant so much. So just even taking a moment of quiet meditation and sending thanks out to the spirit world. A lot of times that is what I'll do.
You can
I
make an
will,
altar. You can put them on
yeah,
your altar.
exactly.
You can
That's
offer
things.
food.
And that's the things I make space on my altar
Yeah.
for the ancestors that I don't know, the ancestors and
The
families
seen and the
that I
unseen,
and the
the
unseen.
known and the unknown.
So
Yeah.
that's, so the altar will have the unknown ancestor and ancestry spirits that come through it, and the remembrance moment of a memory for the people and the ones that I do know and I do
And
recognize, that kind of thing. I tie
allowing
together.
allowing yourself to sit with grief.
Hmm.
Grief can sit dormant for so long within us.
Hmm.
Um and it's kind of an initiation. If you know, you know. If
Hmm.
you have experienced grief, it can have its moments of bubbling up, but sometimes actually just making time to sit with grief and let it cry
Hmm.
out in love that misses the presence of a person that we loved,
Hmm.
um, taking time to allow that grief to be honored and venerated is
Hmm.
a huge way in which we can honor our ancestors at this time of year.
And for me, taking that grief and helping it transition to joy. So for all the grief that I feel of missing someone, I will always end
Gratitude
it
for,
with the gratitude and a memory that we shared, and thinking about that memory. Because for me, it's again with that cycle of life, all tying back to what we're doing before, but I tend to seek out joy. Love is pain, but love is also very much joy. And like I said, what is the quote from WandaVision? What is grief but love enduring?
mm,
And remembering that in the grief, in the pain, there was so much joy and love that came with it. And I choose to try to remember the good
yeah.
and let go of the bad, let go of the negative, let go of that hate, and try to be grateful for the times that I had that brought me joy, that taught me something, that helped me learn something. That's just who I choose to be, for a number of different reasons, for my own mental health, for cycles and patterns and things that I know I have in me, my own type of shadow work. That is my methodology that I have chosen, is letting the grief go, sitting with the grief, and then letting that grief transmute into something else, into joy, into acceptance, into gratefulness and gratitude.
So for me, I am a feeler of all feels, and I'm a
Hmm.
proponent of, honoring the feelings and the messages that come with that. But in my experience with death and, grief as a constant living companion, I think that I've learned that when a person that you love dies, a part of you dies with them, and you lose that part of yourself, and you'll never be the person that you were before they died because it changes you. But I also believe that a part of them lives on in us
Hmm.
as that love is an exchanged energy. And I personally maintain relationships with like my father who passed away when I was 20.
Hmm.
So, half my life ago. And, my friend Karen, I've learned to, rebuild a friendship with her. Um, Grief will make me, as much as I'm for feeling feelings, I can also be really good at avoiding them. But reinitiating into like honoring who they were in my life and what that
Hmm.
meant to me. Raven Moon, I feel like I will always have a spiritual working relationship with
Hmm.
that queer ancestor of mine.
Yes, there's no
Um,
question on that.
yeah, so letting that part of them live on within me that's that finding the joy, right? The being
Hmm.
appreciative and having gratitude for having even known them or exchanged love with them. I let a go of that part of myself that had to die with them, that loved them so much that I wanted to go with them
Hmm.
and be with them on the other side. And still, I think that part of me, is tethered, keeps a tether between me. Like I definitely get messages from my father,
Hmm.
not all the time, but when it happens,
Hmm.
and I need to remember that as I'm finding that joy and gratitude and living on, that I'm doing so in honor of the part of them that lives on
Hmm.
with me.
No, absolutely. I get messages still from my grandparents in dreams most
Yeah.
often, and it's really really interesting about how all of that kind of plays together. Um, I have a very interesting spooky story that kind
Ooh.
of relates to the veil thinning. Because just thinking about dreams and the veil
Yes.
thinning and ancestors
Yes.
really um, this brought this in my head, and kind of, not that I want to transition off the idea of grief and the hardness of it, but again going back to the idea of the veil thinning and being able to walk and talk with spirits or
Yes.
connections and messages from spirits coming through that that you may not know, and the ancestors of the lands that you're on. um so I had just moved out. I had been through divorce, got it into a new house, um, where I was in a new part of town. And it was an older section of Sacramento that had been established very, very early. It was in the Midtown area, so it would had a longer history. Again, again, with California history being maybe less than 200 years old,
Yep.
and US history being no more than about 300 years old. We're not talking about, again, centuries of ancestor here, but it was old enough for the time, for the area. It
Yeah.
was, I think the house I was in was originally built in like 1915 or 1920 or something like that. So it's been
Mm.
again, it was 100 years old, rebuilt, etc. over the time frame. I had just moved in, and again, I moved in June. This is literally Halloween night. This is All Hallows Eve, so it's
Oh.
October 30th. So on October 30th, I was sleeping, and I was in this area. This house was older and had just been through a bunch of different generations and a whole lot of cultural shifts that have happened in that neighborhood over
Mm-hmm.
time. And I was sound asleep, and then all of a sudden, my alarm went off. Now, this is the strange thing is I had a clock that I had set off to the side that was an alarm clock, but all the alarms were turned off. Everything else, I just had it set to be a clock because I didn't need
Mm.
an alarm clock. I had my phone and everything else. And all of a sudden, I get this blaring at exactly midnight on Halloween night. So 12 a.m. on Halloween, I get this
Hey.
blaring radio signal that's coming through. And again, I am by myself for the first time on my own in a house I've
Yeah.
lived in less than 3 months, getting a radio signal coming through, trying like someone is trying to talk and hear and listen and explain what's going on. Um, and I was kind of listening. I'm like going, A, there should be no volume. B, there was no alarm. Nothing else went off. Where is this coming from? And I'm kind of listening to it, and it's kind of got this older time, um, like gospel music kind of playing faintly in between the static and everything else in between. And it's like, okay, I'm acknowledging there's a message that's trying to come through. Thank you, Spirit. Trying not to freak out right now. I've never had anything like this happen to me before. Shut the alarm off, unplugged the clock,
We don't need no
went out
power.
into my living room, made myself a cup of tea, and tried to calm down and process the fact that there was literally a message from Spirit that very clearly came through. I don't know if it was welcoming. I don't know. It was not hostile, but it was definitely along the kind of, well, pray for your soul kind of essence and vibe
Interesting.
that I got. And of course, being
Yeah.
pagan, being in an area that was again profoundly African Methodist area,
Yeah.
grow where that cultural route had been, coming up, and this kind of change in areas. And then what I think is really fascinating beyond that is I had a party, and I can't remember if this was before or after, but right around the same time, I had a housewarming party, and my stepfather is a um, proud metal. He loves metal detecting. He just loves it to pieces. There was a park behind my house, and he had gone through that park several times. Oh, can I bring my metal detector and check out your backyard? Well, go for it.
Oh,
So he
yeah.
did, and he found this metal from the late 1800s, and it was a woman's army help medal from an agency that was one of the few at the time in the late 1800s, early 1900s that a had their membership open to any woman, whether it was you were black, you were white, doesn't matter. So it was one of the few cultural organizations that was really designed to help and assist soldiers as an auxiliary group. And it didn't matter what your race was. It didn't matter any of that.
Wow.
It was open to an area where, again, women didn't have the right to vote. Women didn't have any of that acting. And here's this medal from this organization that defines and celebrated womanhood across all race boundaries in this house. And it again had the kind of that Christian connotation that came through it. But finding that and then having the message that kind of came through, it was again not hostile. It wasn't quite friendly either, but it was more along the lines of, hey, we're here, know who you are, know what can be done, and go from there. So it was really that kind of really interesting connection to spirit. And like I said, the
That's very
timing, it was
cool.
literally the
I
stroke of
remember,
midnight on Halloween when this came through.
wow.
So I
And I
do
remember
not deny the thinning of
seeing
the veil.
I remember seeing that medal. I remember
Uh-huh.
being a part of your housewarming,
Yes.
and you were showing us that medal that you found and telling us the story of the spirit visiting. I remember this. Yeah, this was, yeah. So
It
I had
was,
a somebody once tell me that instead of when you move into a place,
mhm.
obviously it's been there longer than you've lived there.
Yes.
So instead of coming in and like cleansing it spiritually, somebody suggested that you should go in and make friends with the spirits that live there
Hmm.
instead of trying to like banish them
Hmm.
or and obviously different people have different perceptions of
Hmm.
that sort of thing, but just the idea of instead of being like, oh, this is my space now, being like, oh, I want to be in harmony and in balance with
Hmm.
an honor that you've been attached to this land for god knows how long, and I'm just a temporary squatter
Hmm.
in comparison.
Yes, and that was I think that could very well been part of the message that came through because we did a cleansing, we did a welcoming, but we didn't when we initially did it, as you remember, we didn't really, I don't think we touched on the ancestors and the groups that were there. So I think that wanted to come through. I did, like any good pagan, set boundaries and relations and wards at that from that point on that said, hey, I'm acknowledging there are spirits here. If you want to send me
But
any
don't wake me
messages, that's all fine and good. I just ask that you send it to me while I am in the currently spirit journeying or through my dreams. And that was a ward that I set every night from that point on.
Fair, fair. I'm like, you need your
So
beauty rest.
I need to be able to sleep. I need to
Yeah.
understand. I appreciate it. I changed out the clock radio that I had to one that was not a radio. It was just a clock. And but yeah, so I think that's like, I don't know, that's one of those kind of bits of humor for messages that come through as you're dealing with spirits. You have to go back to the idea of consent. It's like, yes, I'm willing to hear the messages, but I want them on
Yeah.
my own terms. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
So I have one last question
Hmm.
around that kind of ties into what you were just talking about, but like while the veil is thin
Hmm.
and we want to honor ancestors of all
Right.
these different flavors, um a lot of people talk about leaving out offerings
Hmm.
and what kind of offerings. For example, I know when I go to someone's grave or grave site,
Hmm.
leaving um you know alcohol, spirits for the
Hmm.
spirit,
Spirits
as
for the spirits.
coins. What other kind of offerings have do you think about for leaving out for honoring and reverence to these spirits of the land, ancestors of the land, ancestors of our community, ancestors of our bloodline?
I really like the idea of leaving things that can decompose out in the world if we're
Same.
going out to something like a gravesite, or I've gone to the edges of a river to honor
Mm,
spirits and do offerings of flowers, or again, like you said, spirits, things that
food,
can, yeah, food that can be nourishment to the creatures that are there that aren't
like
going to
fruits
cause
and
harm.
veggies.
Yeah. So that's, but things will also break down to a natural cycle and become nutrients of the earth. I
Yeah.
don't like the idea of, as much as I love the idea of coins, I actually save coins for my altar rather than
Mm,
giving them out to a place, because they're metal. It's going to take a lot longer to decompose. They are going to be buried underneath things, but also I appreciate that. And then I also try to be practical if you're talking about the idea of going to a groomed grave cemetery, that is an
yeah.
active cemetery where they have to groom and they have to
Right.
keep things up.
Right.
uh, uh, some coins that get can get caught up in blades that can then be flung and do
Yeah.
damage
Not a
to
good
maybe
idea.
an ancestor's tombstone or something else. I don't want to cause damage to something else. I generally don't leave coins or metal bits. Same thing, mylar balloons. No.
I know. I
Um,
get a weird feeling even with just the plastic flowers sometimes. Like, I don't
yeah.
personally choose to do that. I'd rather do dried flowers
Hmm.
or flowers that will dry pretty but will
Yes.
decompose eventually. But I know that people are like, a lot of people's process around visiting graves and stuff is it's there's this weird cultural phenomenon of trying to cheat death.
Hmm.
So we preserve bodies and
Hmm.
we, give them plastic flowers at the gravesite so that they won't die. But
Right.
I kind of lean on the other end of like embracing
Hmm.
death and letting, giving these offerings that will absorb beautifully and
Hmm.
or, you know, yeah, I definitely don't want to do more environmental harm than that's already been done.
Hmm.
But everybody's going to do what works best for them.
Yes, absolutely. And again, I make no judgment when for that.
Yeah.
This is, you asked me about what do I do, and that is what I do, because that's again me trying to be conscious of the different things out there, and my place and my footprint when I'm doing that. Again, fully acknowledging that I am driving a vehicle that consumes petroleum, and I'm living in a world with technology that has its own kind of non-green footprint, and
And
other things,
capitalism.
capitalism, and all those other things. So I don't think there's a way to be non-consumerist, but I do try to be at least acknowledgement of what I am doing and try to help offset some of that a little bit. And to me, there's this, and again, this could be complete fancy, but to me, the idea of providing living flowers. I love your idea of dried flowers. I think it's beautiful. Living flowers, the dead can't cross over and reach the living, but if the flowers are there that were alive, and as they die and they wither, they become part of that spirit world. So I see in my head this vision of my ancestors taking the spirit and the essence of the flowers that I put and take that joy and that life and that consuming of it coming in that idea of as they're going and dying. So if they can't reach the beauty of a plastic flower. It wasn't alive. It's never
Right.
been alive. There's no essence and no spirit to it, but they can collect and and feel and appreciate the spirit of the flowers and the things that were growing that have become a part of them and a part of that cycle of life. So it's a fanciful thing, but that's just how I see it. Is I can see my ancestors reaching out for the flowers that have passed, and collecting those roses, collecting those um, chrysanthemums or anything else that I happen to be out there.
When I return to the graveyard this fall, I hope to find these beautifully dried giant sunflowers that I had left there in the
Mhm.
spring. But, we'll see. We'll see if they're
Right.
still there or not, because nature does its own thing.
Yes.
So, yes, that is very, very, very beautiful.
Are there
And
other things that you do? I know you mentioned most of it, but I was just saying, is there anything that sparked an idea or?
well, so when I did a lot of rituals, one of the things that I kind of learned is, if you do ritual food and drink,
Mhm.
you give libations back to the earth. So you don't ever give libations to the gods or to the earth that you wouldn't intake yourself. So
Mhm.
I love the idea of like picnicking and sharing a meal with the dead and letting it
Mhm.
decompose, because even if the spirits themselves don't consume it, the nature around
Mhm.
the other residents, the ants and the worms and the raccoons and the squirrels and the skunks, and I leave stuff for nature to enjoy,
Mhm.
in honor of you know sharing a picnic. But one other thing is, when my babies were babies,
Mhm.
I specifically remember, sometimes this can be blamed on Mercury retrograde sometimes, but a lot of times it can also be blamed with just like so much spirit energy happening
Mhm.
around you. But like technology can get a little wonky.
Mhm.
Technology can not be working right for inexplicable reasons. So I was taught that light a candle when you feel like so I had a lot of ancestors or spirits visiting my
Mhm.
infant children. I swear this happened both times I brought them home. So I learned to keep a candle lit as long as you're conscious and awake and
Mhm.
able to tend it. But that a candle in and of itself is feeding the spirits who are visiting, and they'll feed
Mm.
off of the energy of the light of the candle and leave your electronics alone.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah. So that's also a nice, and I definitely, once the weather stops being summer warm, I'm
Mhm.
like, I want to light a candle. I want to keep a candle lit. I want the room to smell like a candle or whatever. So yeah,
Mhm.
I'm definitely I love feeding spirits with candlelight.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, I think
Well,
that we've given a lot of information for people to digest, and I
mhm.
I know that I've got some fun, if you want to learn more, links that we can
Mhm.
include in show notes about,
Yes.
various traditions
Different
around
cultures from around the world. We'll link to
how to
kind of,
pronounce Samhain.
yes, how to pronounce that one. Again, we could even put in some links for different underworld descent myths. So we can put in a
Yeah.
link for the myth of
Oh,
Inanna. We can put in
yeah.
links for Persephone, um, and other cultural things too. So we'll see what we can do to kind of help that too. And again, by all
If
means,
we've
look for,
inspired any of y'all to bunny rabbit with us, come
yes,
down the
please.
rabbit hole. But for now, I think I would like to say thank you for listening to the Queer Witch Project. If you enjoyed this show, please that helps us a lot. Subscribe. We like to see you come back, and leave us some comments. We love interacting with you.
And if there is a topic you want to know more about, or an episode topic you'd like to suggest, please contact us at thequeerwitchproject@gmail.com, or find us on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram with a handle at Queer Witch Project. We upload twice a month. Remember, queerness is a key to magic.
Be yourself and love rebelliously.